Arthur Conan Doyle, The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. In recording from time to time some of the extraordinary events and interesting reminiscences associated with my old friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have continually faced difficulties caused by his own aversion to publicity. To this somber skeptic, the noisy applause of the crowd was always distasteful. After a brilliant solution to yet another mystery, he took a genuine delight in yielding his laurels to some plodding official from Scotland Yard, listening with a sardonic smile to the loud chorus of misplaced congratulations. This behavior of my friend, and by no means a lack of compelling material, is the reason why I have rarely been able to publish new records in recent years. The truth is that participation in some of his adventures was an honor that always demanded from me the utmost discretion and restraint. Imagine, then, my astonishment when, last Tuesday, I received a telegram from Holmes. He never sent letters if a telegram would suffice. It read, "Why not write of the Cornish horror, the most extraordinary case in my practice?" I had no idea what had revived this event in Holmes's memory or what whim had prompted him to telegraph me. However, fearing he might change his mind, I immediately sought out the notes containing the exact details of the incident and hastened to present my story to the readers. In the spring of 1897, Holmes's iron constitution had somewhat faltered under the weight of heavy, strenuous work, especially since he never spared himself. In the month of March, Dr. Moore Agar of Harley Street, who had become acquainted with Holmes under most dramatic circumstances, a story I shall tell some other time, categorically declared that the famous detective must temporarily abandon all work and take a thorough rest if he did not wish for a total breakdown. Holmes received this news with indifference, for his mental activity was entirely independent of his physical state. But when the physician threatened that Holmes might become permanently incapable of work, he was finally persuaded to change his surroundings. And so, in the early spring of that year, we settled in a small cottage near Polda Bay at the furthest extremity of the Cornish peninsula. This singular land perfectly suited the somber mood of my patient. From the windows of our whitewashed house, perched high upon a green headland, there opened the entire sinister semicircle of Mounts Bay. Since time immemorial, it has been known as a deadly trap for sailing vessels. Many a mariner has met his end upon its black crags and submerged reefs. Under a northern wind, the bay appeared serene, sheltered from storms, beckoning storm-driven ships with the promise of peace and protection. But suddenly, a hurricane would roar in from the southwest. The vessel would be torn from its anchor, and on the lee shore, amidst the foam of the breakers, a struggle for life and death would begin. Experienced sailors kept far away from this accursed place. The land surrounding our house left an impression as bleak as the sea itself. All around lay a moorland plain, dismal and deserted, where only lonely church towers hinted at the location of ancient hamlets. Everywhere one saw traces of some forgotten tribe that had long since perished, leaving behind only fantastic stone monuments, scattered burial mounds, and curious earthworks that brought to mind prehistoric battles. The magical spells of this mysterious place and the sinister ghosts of forgotten races acted upon my friend's imagination. He would take long walks upon the peat moors, surrendering himself to deep reflection. Holmes also became interested in the ancient Cornish language, and if my memory serves me correctly, he suggested that it was akin to Chaldean and had been largely derived from the Phoenician merchants who came here for tin. He ordered a pile of books on philology and had just settled down to develop his theory when, to my deep regret and his unconcealed delight, we found ourselves drawn into a mystery, more complex, more gripping, and certainly 100 times more enigmatic than any of those which had driven us to leave London. Our modest life and peaceful, healthy rest were rudely interrupted, and we were swept into a whirlwind of events that shocked not only Cornwall, but the whole of Western England. Many readers probably remember the Cornish horror, as it was then called, though I must tell you that the London press possessed very incomplete data. And now, 13 years later, the time has come to inform you of all the authentic details of this inconceivable occurrence. I have already mentioned that infrequent church towers indicated the villages scattered across this part of Cornwall. The nearest to us was the hamlet of Tredannick Wallace, where the cottages of 100 or so inhabitants clustered around an ancient, moss-covered church. The vicar of this parish, Mr. Roundhay, was an enthusiast of archaeology. It was on this ground that Holmes had made his acquaintance. He was a jovial, stout man of middle age who knew the local countryside well. Once he invited us for a cup of tea, and at his house we met Mr. Mortimer Tregennies, a man of independent means, who supplemented the vicar's meager income by renting several rooms in his large, rambling house. The solitary vicar was pleased with this arrangement, though he had little in common with his lodger, a thin, dark-haired man with spectacles, so stooped that at first glance he appeared to be a hunchback. I remember that during our short visit, the vicar impressed us as a tireless talker, whereas his lodger was strangely uncommunicative, sad, and pensive. He sat staring at a single point, evidently occupied with his own thoughts. And so on Tuesday, the 16th of March, as we were finishing our post-breakfast pipes and preparing for our usual walk upon the peat moors, these two men burst into our little sitting room. "Mr. Holmes," gasped the vicar, "a terrible tragedy has occurred this night. It is simply unheard of. Surely Providence itself has brought you here just in time, for if anyone in England can help, it is you." I cast a none too friendly glance at the intrusive vicar, but Holmes removed the pipe from his mouth and became alert, like an old hound hearing the hunter's call. He gestured for them to sit, and our agitated visitor and his companion took their places on the sofa. Mr. Mortimer Tregennies had more control over himself, but the convulsive twitching of his thin hands and the feverish glitter in his dark eyes showed that he was no less distressed. "Who shall tell the story, I or you?" he asked the vicar. "I do not know what has happened to you," said Holmes, "but since you appear to have made the discovery, you had better tell it. After all, the vicar learned of it from you." I glanced at the hastily dressed vicar and his neatly attired neighbor, and was inwardly amused by the astonishment that Holmes's simple logical deduction had caused upon their faces. "Allow me to say a few words," began the vicar, "and then you shall decide for yourself whether to hear the details from Mr. Tregennies or to hasten at once to the scene of this mysterious occurrence. What has happened is this. Yesterday evening our friend was a guest at the home of his brothers, Owen and George, and his sister, Brenda, at their house in Tredannick Wallace, which is near the ancient stone cross upon the moors. He left them shortly after 10 o'clock. Before that, they had been playing cards in the dining room, and all were healthy and in excellent spirits. This morning, before breakfast, our friend, who is always a very early riser, went for a walk in the direction of his relative's house, and there he was overtaken by the dog-cart of Dr. Richards. It turned out that the doctor had been urgently summoned to Tredannick Wallace. Naturally, Mr. Mortimer Tregennies went along with him. Upon arrival, they discovered something incredible. The sister and brothers were sitting around the table in exactly the same positions as he had left them, with the cards still lying before them, but the candles had burned down into their sockets. The sister lay dead in her chair, and on either side of her sat the brothers. They were screaming, singing, laughing. Their reason had fled. On the faces of all three, the dead woman and the madman alike, was frozen an expression of unspeakable fear, a grimace of horror that was ghastly to behold. There are no signs that any outsiders were in the house, except for Mistress Porter, their old cook and housekeeper, who reported that she had slept soundly all night and heard nothing. Nothing has been stolen. Everything is in perfect order, and it is completely incomprehensible what could have frightened them so much that a woman lost her life and the men their minds. That, in brief, is all, Mr. Holmes, and if you can help us clear this up, you will have done a great deed. I had still cherished some hope of persuading my friend to return to the rest, which was the object of our journey. But one glance at his concentrated face and knitted brows made it clear that such hopes were in vain. Holmes remained silent, entirely absorbed by the extraordinary drama which had broken into our quiet life. "I shall take up the case," he said at last. "As I understand it, the circumstances are exceptional. Have you been there yourself, Mr. Roundhay?" "No, Mr. Holmes. As soon as I heard of this misfortune from Mr. Tregennies, we hastened here at once to consult you." "How far is the house where this terrible tragedy took place?" "About a mile from here." "Then we shall go together. But first, Mr. Mortimer Tregennies, I wish to ask you a few questions." During all this time, the man had not uttered a sound, but I observed that inwardly he was far more agitated than the bustling and talkative vicar. His face had turned pale and distorted. His restless gaze never left Holmes, while his thin hands continually clenched and unclenched. As the vicar recounted the dreadful occurrence, Tregennies's blanched lips trembled, and it seemed as if the horrible scene was reflected in the depths of his dark eyes. "Ask anything you deem necessary, Mr. Holmes," he said with readiness. "It is painful to speak of it, but I shall hide nothing from you. Tell me about yesterday evening." "Well, Mr. Holmes, as the vicar has already told you, we had supper together, and afterwards my elder brother George suggested a game of whist. We sat down to cards at about 9 o'clock. At 10:15, I prepared to go home. They were sitting at the table, healthy and cheerful. Who closed the door after you?" "Mistress Porter had already gone to bed, and no one saw me out. I shut the hall door behind me myself. The window of the room where they sat was closed, but the curtains were not drawn. This morning, both the door and the window were found exactly as they had been yesterday, and there is no reason to believe that any stranger entered the house. And yet, terror has clouded my brother's minds, and terror has killed Brenda. If only you could have seen how she lay, slumped over the arm of her chair. I shall never forget that room as long as I live." "What you tell me is truly unprecedented," said Holmes. "But, as I understand it, you have no suggestion as to the cause of what happened?" "It is devilry, Mr. Holmes, sheer devilry," cried Mortimer Tregennies. "It is some unclean force. Something terrible enters the room, and men lose their reason. Is any human being capable of such a thing? Well, if it is beyond the power of man, then I fear the solution may also be beyond my power," Holmes remarked. "However, before we accept your version, we must exhaust all physical causes. As for you, Mr. Tregennies, I understand that you were once not on the best of terms with your relatives. You lived apart, did you not?" "Yes, that was so, Mr. Holmes, though it is a thing of the past. You see, our family owned tin mines in Redruth, but later we sold them to a company and, having acquired the means to live in comfort, we moved away. I will not deny that we quarreled over the division of the money and were estranged for a time, but what is past, and we have become the best of friends once more. However, let's return to the events of yesterday evening. Can you recall nothing which might, even indirectly, throw some light upon this tragedy? Think carefully, Mr. Tregennies, for any hint may help me. No, sir, I can recall nothing at all. Were your relatives in their usual spirits? Yes, in excellent spirits. Were they not nervous people? Had they no forebodings of some approaching danger? No, never. You can help me with nothing more? Mortimer Tregennies ransacked his memory. One thing I do remember, he said at last. As we were playing cards, I sat with my back to the window, and my brother George, who was my partner, sat facing it. Suddenly, I noticed that he was staring intently over my shoulder. I turned and looked as well. The window was closed, but the curtains had not yet been drawn, and I could see the bushes on the lawn. It seemed to me that something was moving among them. I could not tell if it were a man or an animal, but I felt that someone was there. When I asked my brother what he was looking at, he replied that he, too, thought he had seen something. That, in fact, was all. And you did not go to see what it was? No, the matter passed out of my mind at once. When you left, had you no ill forebodings? None in the least. It is not quite clear to me how you heard the news at such an early hour. I am an early riser and usually take a walk before breakfast. I had just stepped out this morning when the doctor's dog cart overtook me. He told me that old Mistress Porter had sent a lad for him with an urgent summons. I jumped into the cart, and we drove on. There, we rushed at once into that ghastly room. The candles and the fire had long since gone out, and they must have sat in the dark until dawn. The doctor said that Brenda had been dead for at least 6 hours. There were no signs of violence. She lay in her chair, slumped over the arm, with that same expression of horror upon her face. George and Owen were singing songs in different keys and muttering like two orangutans. Oh, it was awful. I could hardly bear it, and the doctor turned as white as a sheet. He felt faint and sank into a chair. It was lucky that we did not have to attend to him as well. Remarkable, simply remarkable, said Holmes, rising and reaching for his hat. I think it would be best to proceed to Tridanic Wartha without delay. I must confess that I have seldom encountered a case which at first sight appeared so extraordinary. That morning, our inquiries made little progress. Yet, at the very outset, an incident occurred which left a most depressing effect upon me. We were walking toward the scene of the tragedy along a narrow, winding country lane. Seeing a carriage rattling toward us, we stepped onto the verge to let it pass. As it drew level with us, a snarling, distorted face with bulging eyes flashed behind the raised glass. Those staring eyes and grinding teeth passed us like a vision in a nightmare. My brothers, cried Mortimer Tregennies, turning deathly pale. They are taking them to Helston. In horror, we watched the black carriage rumbling down the road, and then we turned once more toward the house where such a strange fate had overtaken them. It was a spacious, bright house, more of a villa than a cottage, with a large garden where, thanks to the mild Cornish climate, the spring flowers were already fragrant. It was into this garden that the sitting-room window looked, the window through which, as Mortimer Tregennies claimed, some evil spirit had entered to bring such misery to the inhabitants. Before stepping onto the porch, Holmes walked slowly and thoughtfully along the path and between the flower beds. I remember he was so lost in thought that he tripped over a watering can, which overturned upon the path, drenching our feet. Inside, we were met by the elderly housekeeper, Mistress Porter, who managed the household with the help of a young maidservant. She answered all of Holmes's questions readily. No, she had heard nothing during the night. Yes, the family had been in excellent spirits lately. Never had she seen them so cheerful and content. She had fainted with terror when she entered the room in the morning and saw them at the table. Upon coming to her senses, she had thrown open the window to let in the morning air and then rushed out to the road to hail a farm lad and send him for the doctor. If we wished to see her, the mistress was lying in her bedroom, for brawny orderlies had barely managed the brothers when placing them in the carriage. As for herself, she would not stay in this house even until tomorrow, but would leave immediately for St. Ives to be with her relatives. We went upstairs and viewed the body of Brenda Tregennies. Even now, anyone would have said she had been a beauty in her youth. In death, she was still beautiful, though the fine features of her dark face bore the seal of horror, the last sensation of her life. From the bedroom, we descended to the sitting room where this incredible drama had unfolded. The ashes still lay in the fireplace. On the table stood the 4 guttered, burnt-out candles and the scattered cards. The chairs had been pushed back against the walls, but no other objects had been touched. Holmes walked around the room with light, quick steps. He sat in the chairs, moved them, and arranged them as they had stood the night before. He gauged how much of the garden was visible from various points. He examined the floor, the ceiling, and the fireplace. But not once did I observe that sudden flash in his eyes or the tightening of his lips which would have told me that a glimmer of a solution had crossed his mind. Why was the fire lit? He asked suddenly. Is a fire lit in such a small room, even in the springtime? Mortimer Tregennies explained that the evening had been cold and damp. Therefore, a fire was lit upon his arrival. What do you intend to do next, Mr. Holmes? He asked. With a smile, my friend placed his hand upon my shoulder. You know, Watson, I fear I must once again take up my pipe and invite your most justified reproaches, he said. With your permission, gentlemen, we shall return home, for I do not expect to find anything new here. I shall analyze all the known facts, Mr. Tregennies, and if anything should occur to me, I shall immediately notify you and the vicar. For now, allow me to wish you both a very good day. Upon returning to Polder Cottage, Holmes sank into a concentrated silence. He sat with his legs tucked up in a deep armchair, entirely shrouded in blue wreaths of tobacco smoke. His dark brows were drawn together. A furrow creased his forehead, and his eyes, set in the gaunt face of an ascetic, stared fixedly at a single point. After a long period of reflection, he tossed aside his pipe and sprang to his feet. It is of no use, Watson. He laughed. Let us rather wander out and search for flint arrows. We are more likely to find them than the key to this mystery. To force the brain to work when there is insufficient material for that work is like overheating a motor. It will fly to pieces. Sea air, sunshine, and patience. That is what we need, Watson, and the rest will follow. Now, let us quietly discuss our position. Watson, he continued as we walked along the cliffside path. We must firmly grasp what is known so that we may fit new facts into their proper places as they appear. Let us agree, first of all, that devilry has nothing to do with it. Let us dismiss that from our minds. Very well. Instead, we have before us 3 unfortunate victims of some deliberate or involuntary crime committed by a human being. Let us proceed from that basis. Next, when did it happen? If we are to believe Mortimer Tregennies, it evidently occurred immediately after his departure. This is most significant. Probably everything took place within the next few minutes. The cards are still upon the table. At that hour, the household would normally be retiring to bed. Yet they remained seated, without even having moved their chairs. So, I repeat, it happened immediately after his departure, and certainly no later than 11 o'clock at night. Let us now trace, as far as possible, the movements of Mortimer Tregennies after he left the room. This is not difficult, and he seems beyond suspicion. You are well acquainted with my methods, and have surely guessed that the somewhat clumsy ruse with the watering can was necessary for me to obtain a clear print of his foot. It was impressed perfectly upon the damp sand. Last night, as you recall, was also damp, and I easily traced his path. By all accounts, he walked quickly toward the vicarage. Since Mortimer Tregennies vanishes from a scene, it follows that someone else appeared before the card players. Who was it? And how did they manage to inspire such terror? Mistress Porter is out of the question. She is clearly uninvolved. Can it be proven that someone crept from the garden to the window and, by their appearance, brought about this tragic end? The only suggestion of this comes again from Mortimer Tregennies, who said that his brother noticed some movement in the garden. This is strange, for the night was dark, it was raining, and if anyone intending to frighten these people wanted to be noticed, he would have had to press his face against the window pane. Yet beneath the window lies a wide flower bed, and not a single footprint. It is difficult to imagine how a stranger, under these circumstances, could have produced such a ghastly impression. Moreover, we find no suitable motive for such an inexplicable act. Do you perceive our difficulties, Watson? Indeed I do, I replied with conviction. And yet, if new data appears, we shall overcome these difficulties. In your immense archives, Watson, I believe there are many cases just as obscure. Nevertheless, let us set the matter aside until we obtain more precise information, and finish the morning by searching for Neolithical man. I believe I have already mentioned that my friend possessed an extraordinary faculty for completely detaching his mind from any case. But never was I more amazed by it than on that spring morning in Cornwall. For 2 hours on end, he discoursed upon celts, flint arrowheads, and pottery shards as light-heartedly as if the sinister mystery had never existed. It was only upon our return home that we found a visitor waiting for us, who immediately recalled us to reality. There is no need for him to introduce himself. That giant frame, the weather-beaten and deeply lined face, the burning eyes, the eagle beak of a nose, and the grizzled head that almost brushed the ceiling. These traits were well known in London as well as in Africa. The golden-brown beard, streaked with silver and stained yellow near the lips by an eternal cigar, could belong to only one man, Dr. Leon Sterndale, the famous explorer and lion hunter. We had heard that he lived somewhere in the neighborhood, and had more than once observed his mighty figure upon the moors. However, he had shown no desire for our acquaintance, nor had it occurred to us to seek his, for we knew that it was a love of solitude which prompted him to spend the greater part of his time between voyages in a small cottage hidden in a grove at Beecham Arians. There he lived in utter seclusion, surrounded by books and maps, attending to his own simple needs and showing no interest in the affairs of his neighbors. Therefore, I was surprised by the vehemence with which he questioned Holmes as to whether he had succeeded in unraveling any part of this unfathomable mystery. "The police are at a standstill," he said, "but perhaps your great experience may suggest some plausible explanation. I ask you to confide in me because, during my frequent visits here, I became closely acquainted with the Tregennies family. They are even relatives of mine on my mother's side, she being a native of these parts. You will understand that their terrible fate has shocked me. I must tell you that I was bound for Africa and was already in Plymouth when I learned of this event this morning, and I returned at once to assist in the investigation." Holmes raised his eyebrows. "You missed your steamer for this? I shall take the next. My word, that is friendship indeed. I have told you we are relatives." "Yes, I remember, on the maternal side." "Was your luggage already on board?" "Not all of it. The greater part was still at the hotel." "I see. The news could hardly have reached the Plymouth papers by this morning?" "No, sir. I received a telegram." "Might I ask from whom?" The explorer's gaunt face darkened. "You are too inquisitive, Mr. Holmes. It is my profession." Dr. Sterndale regained his composure with an effort. "I see no reason to hide it from you," he said. "The telegram was sent by Mr. Roundhay, the vicar." "I thank you," Holmes replied. "As to your question, I can only say that the heart of the matter is not yet entirely clear to me, but I firmly expect to reach the truth. That is all for now. Could you say whether you suspect anyone?" "To that, I cannot give you an answer." "In that case, I have come in vain. I shall detain you no longer." The famous traveler strode out of our cottage, visibly annoyed. Holmes followed shortly after. He was gone until evening, and when he returned, he looked tired and dissatisfied, and I realized that his inquiries had not been crowned with success. A telegram was waiting for him. He glanced through it and tossed it into the fire. "It is from Plymouth, Watson, from the hotel," he explained. "I learned its name from the vicar and telegraphed there to verify Dr. Sterndale's words. He did indeed spend the night there, and a portion of his luggage did indeed go on to Africa. He himself returned to be present at the investigation." "What do you make of it, Watson?" "He is evidently very interested in the case." "Yes, very. Here is a thread which we have not yet grasped, and yet it may lead us out of the labyrinth. Be of good cheer, Watson. I am certain that we do not yet know everything. When we know more, all the difficulties will lie behind us." I had no idea that Holmes's words would come true so soon, nor how strange and ghastly our new discovery would be, turning our investigation in a completely different direction. In the morning, while I was shaving, I heard the clatter of hooves and, looking out of the window, saw a dog cart dashing down the road at full speed. At our gate, the horse stopped, and our friend the vicar jumped out and ran up the garden path as fast as his legs could carry him. Holmes was already dressed, and we both hastened to meet him. Our guest was too agitated to speak at first, but finally, gasping and choking, he cried out, "We are at the mercy of the devil, Mr. Holmes. My poor parish is at the mercy of the devil." He panted. "Satan himself has taken up his abode there. We are in his hands." He was dancing on the spot with excitement, and it would have been comic had it not been for his ashen face and distracted eyes. Then he blurted out his terrible news. "Mr. Mortimer Tregennies died last night in exactly the same way as his sister." Holmes sprang up instantly, full of energy. "Is there room in your dog cart?" "Yes." "Watson, breakfast later." "Mr. Roundhay, we are ready." "Quick, quick, before anything is moved." Mortimer Tregennies occupied 2 corner rooms in the vicarage, situated separately, one above the other. Below was a spacious sitting room, and above was the bedroom. Directly beneath the windows was a croquet lawn. We arrived ahead of both the doctor and the police, so no one had yet entered. Allow me to describe exactly the scene we saw on that misty March morning. It is forever engraved in my memory. The air in the room was incredibly stifling and oppressive. Had the maid not thrown open the window early in the morning, it would have been impossible to breathe. This was partly explained by the fact that a lamp was still smoking on the table. Beside the table, leaning back in his armchair, sat the dead man. His thin beard was bristling, his spectacles were pushed up on his forehead, and on his gaunt, dark face, turned toward the window, was frozen that same expression of horror which we had seen on the face of his late sister. Judging by his convulsively cramped limbs and interlaced fingers, he had died in a paroxysm of fear. He was dressed, though we noticed he had dressed in a hurry. And as we already knew that he had gone to bed the night before, it was evident that his tragic end had overtaken him early in the morning. As soon as we entered the fatal room, Holmes was transformed. His outward stoicism was instantly replaced by fierce energy. He became tense and alert. His eyes sparkled, his face set, and he moved with feverish speed. He dashed out onto the lawn, climbed back through the window, ran around the room, and raced upstairs, exactly like a hound that has caught the scent of its prey. He took a rapid look around the bedroom and threw open the window. Here, evidently, a new cause for excitement appeared, for he leaned out with loud exclamations of interest and joy. Then he rushed downstairs, ran into the garden, prostrated himself upon the grass, sprang up, and darted back into the room, all with the zeal of a hunter following a trail. He was particularly interested in the lamp, which appeared quite ordinary, and he measured its reservoir. Then, using a magnifying glass, he carefully examined the smoke guard that covered the top of the lamp chimney, and, having scraped a little soot from its outer surface, he placed it in an envelope and tucked it into his pocketbook. Finally, after the arrival of the police and the doctor, he signaled to the vicar, and the three of us went out onto the lawn. "I'm glad to inform you that my inquiries have not been fruitless," he announced. "I do not intend to discuss this case with the police. However, I will ask you, Mr. Roundhay, to convey my compliments to the inspector and draw his attention to the bedroom window and the lamp in the sitting room. Each in itself is suggestive, but together they lead to definite conclusions. If the inspector requires further information, I shall be happy to see him at my cottage. And now, Watson, I think we had best be going." Perhaps the inspector felt slighted by the interference of a private detective, or perhaps he imagined himself to be on the right track. At any rate, for 2 days we heard nothing of him. Holmes spent little time at home during this interval, and when he did return, he would dose or smoke. He took his long walks in solitude, never mentioning where he went. However, one experiment of Holmes's helped me to understand the direction of his thoughts. He bought a lamp, an exact duplicate of the one that had been burning in Mortimer Tregenni's room on the morning of the tragedy. Having filled it with the same kerosene used at the vicarage, he carefully calculated the time it took to burn out. Another of his experiments proved to be far less innocent, and I fear I shall not forget it until my dying day. "You probably remember, Watson," he began one evening, "that in all the testimonies we have heard, there is a common thread. I mean the effect of the room's atmosphere on those who are first to enter. Do you remember Mortimer Tregenni's, describing his last visit to his brother's house, mentioned that the doctor, upon entering the room, almost lost consciousness? Have you forgotten? For I remember it perfectly. Furthermore, do you recall the housekeeper, Mistress Porter, telling us that she felt faint as she entered and therefore opened the window? And after the death of Mortimer Tregenni's, you surely cannot have forgotten the terrible stifling air in the room, even though the maid had already flung the window open? As I learned later, she became so ill that she took to her bed. You must agree, Watson, this is highly suspicious." In both cases, we find the same phenomenon, a poison atmosphere. In both cases, something was burning in the rooms. In the first instance, it was the fire. In the second, the lamp. The fire in the grate was necessary for warmth, but the lamp was lit after dawn. This is evident from the level of the oil. Why? Because there is a connection between three factors: combustion, a stifling atmosphere, and, finally, the madness or death of these unfortunate souls. I trust this is clear to you? Yes, it seems clear enough. At any rate, we may accept it as a working hypothesis. Suppose, then, that in both cases some substance was burned which poisoned the air. Excellent. In the first case, with the Tregenni's family, this substance was thrown into the fire. The window was closed, but the toxic fumes, naturally, escaped up the chimney. Therefore, the effect was weaker than in the second case, where they had no outlet. This is evident from the results. In the first instance, only the woman died, being the more vulnerable creature, while the men suffered a temporary or hopeless loss of reason, which is obviously the first stage of the poisoning. In the second case, the result was complete. Thus, the facts support the theory of poisoning through the combustion of a certain substance. Proceeding from this, I naturally expected to find traces of this substance in Mortimer Tregenni's room. In all probability, they would be sought upon the lamp guard. As I anticipated, there were flakes of soot, and around the edges, a rim of brown powder which had not had time to burn. If you remember, I scraped away half of this powder and placed it in an envelope. Why only half, Holmes? It is not my custom to stand in the way of the police, Watson. I left them all the evidence. Whether they have the wit to find anything on that guard is a matter for their own intelligence. And now, Watson, we shall light our own lamp. However, to prevent the premature demise of two worthy members of society, we shall open the window. Sit near it in that armchair, unless, of course, as a man of sense, you decline to take part in the experiment. Ah, I see you are determined to stand by me. I never believed in you in vain, my dear Watson. I shall sit opposite, facing you, so that we are at an equal distance from the lamp. We shall leave the door ajar. Now we can observe each other, and if the symptoms become threatening, the experiment must be stopped at once. Is that clear? Now, I take from the envelope the powder, or rather, what remains of it, and place it upon the burning lamp. There. Now, Watson, sit back and wait. The wait was not long. I had scarcely settled myself when I became aware of a heavy, thick, nauseous odor. With the very first breath, my reason clouded, and I lost all self-control. A dense black cloud swirled before my eyes, and I suddenly felt that within it lurked everything most terrible, monstrous, and evil in the world, and this unseen force was ready to strike me dead. Whirling and swaying in this black mist, vague phantoms menacingly heralded the inevitable appearance of some frightful creature, and the mere thought of it made my heart feel as though it would burst. I grew cold with terror. My hair stood on end, my eyes started from their sockets, my mouth fell open, and my tongue became like lead. There was such a roaring in my head that it seemed my brain could not endure it and would fly to pieces. I tried to scream, but hearing a horse croaking from somewhere far away, I realized with difficulty that it was my own voice. At that same instant, with a desperate effort, I tore through the sinister veil and saw before me a white mask, distorted by a grimace of horror, the very expression I had so recently seen upon the faces of the dead. Now I saw it upon the face of Holmes. And then came a moment of lucidity. I sprang from my chair, threw my arms around Holmes and, staggering, dragged him toward the door. A moment later, we were lying upon the grass, feeling the bright rays of the sun dispel the horror that had frozen us. It slowly faded from our souls, like morning mist, until our reason finally returned, and with it, our peace of mind. We sat upon the grass, wiping the cold sweat from our brows, and anxiously noting upon each other's faces the last traces of our perilous experiment. "Upon my word, Watson, I am in your debt," Holmes said at last in an unsteady voice. "Please accept my apologies. It was unjustifiable to venture upon such an experiment, and doubly unjustifiable to involve a friend. Believe me, I am sincerely sorry." "You know," I replied, moved by Holmes's unprecedented heartiness, "that to help you is my greatest joy and an honor." Then he spoke again in his usual half-jocular, half-skeptical tone. "Still, my dear Watson, it was quite unnecessary to expose yourself to such danger. Certainly, an outside observer would have concluded that we had lost our minds even before conducting this reckless experiment. I must admit, I never expected the effect to be so sudden and so powerful." Rushing into the house, he emerged with a burning lamp in his outstretched hand and flung it into a thicket of brambles. "Let the room air out a bit. Now, Watson, I trust you have no further doubts as to how both these tragedies occurred." "None whatsoever. And yet, the motive remains as obscure as before. Let us go to the summer-house and discuss it there. My throat is still parched from that foul stuff. Now, all the facts point to Mortimer Tregennies as the perpetrator in the first case, although in the second, he himself became the victim. First and foremost, we must not forget that there was a quarrel in the family, followed by a reconciliation. It is unknown how serious the quarrel was or how sincere the reconciliation. Nevertheless, this Mortimer Tregennies, with his fox-like face and cunning eyes glinting behind his spectacles, strikes me as a rather vindictive man. Do you remember, finally, that it was he who informed us of someone's presence in the garden, a piece of information that temporarily diverted our attention from the true cause of the tragedy? He needed to put us on a false scent for some reason. And if it was not he who threw the powder into the fire as he left the room, then who was it? For everything happened immediately after his departure. Had a new guest appeared, the family would surely have risen to meet him. But do guests arrive after 10 o'clock at night in peaceful Cornwall? Thus, all the facts indicate that Mortimer Tregennies was the criminal. Then he committed suicide. Yes, Watson, that conclusion would seem to follow. A man with guilt upon his soul, having destroyed his own family, might be driven to suicide by remorse. However, there is strong evidence to the contrary. Fortunately, there is a man in England who knows the truth, and I have taken steps to ensure we hear it from his own lips this very day. Ah, here he is. This way, up this path, Mr. Sterndale. We have been conducting a chemical experiment in the house, and our room is now unfit for the reception of so distinguished a guest. I heard the click of the garden gate, and the majestic figure of the famous African explorer appeared upon the path. He walked with some surprise toward the summer house where we were sitting. "You sent for me, Mr. Holmes. I received your note about an hour ago, and have come, though it is quite beyond my understanding why I should comply with your demands. I trust that everything will become clear to you in the course of our conversation," said Holmes. "Meanwhile, I am very much obliged to you for coming. Forgive this reception in the summer house, but my friend Watson and I nearly added a new chapter to the Cornish horror, as the newspapers call it, and therefore we prefer the fresh air. Perhaps it is even better so, for we may talk without fear of eavesdroppers, especially since this matter concerns you most directly. The traveler took the cigar from his mouth and stared sternly at my friend. I utterly fail to understand, sir, said he, what you imply by saying that this concerns me most directly. The murder of Mortimer Tregennies, Holmes replied. At that moment, I regretted that I was not armed. Sterndale's face turned crimson with rage. His eyes flashed. The veins on his forehead stood out like cords, and, clenching his fists, he lunged toward my friend. But he stopped instantly and, with a superhuman effort, regained a masked composure which was, perhaps, more menacing than his former unrestrained outburst. I have lived so long among savages beyond the law, he said, that I have become a law unto myself. Do not forget that, Mr. Holmes. I did not wish to do you a mischief, nor did I wish to harm you, Dr. Sterndale. The simplest proof of that is the fact that I sent for you, and not for the police. Sterndale sat down, breathing heavily. Perhaps for the first time in his adventurous life, he was struck by a sense of awe. It was impossible to resist Holmes's immovable calm. Our guest hesitated for a moment, clenching and unclenching his huge fists. What do you mean? He asked at last. If this is blackmail, Mr. Holmes, you have mistaken your man. Come, let's get to the point. What do you mean? I will tell you, Holmes replied, and I tell you because I hope that you will meet frankness with frankness. What happens next depends entirely upon how you justify yourself. Justify myself? Yes, sir. Against what charge? Against the charge of murdering Mortimer Tregennies. Sterndale wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. This is beyond all bounds. He exclaimed, Does your reputation rest upon such skillful blackmail? It is you who are dealing in blackmail, not I, Dr. Sterndale, Holmes replied sternly. These are the facts upon which my conclusions are based. Your return from Plymouth while your luggage proceeded to Africa first suggested to me that you required special attention. I returned to, I have heard your explanations and find them unconvincing. Let's pass that by. Then you came to ask whom I suspected. I gave you no answer. You then went to the vicarage, waited there without entering, and finally returned home. How do you know that? I followed you. I saw no one. I intended that you should not. During the night, you lay awake brooding over a plan which you decided to execute in the early morning. As soon as it was light, you left your house, took several handfuls of reddish pebbles from the pile of gravel by your gate, and put them in your pocket. Sterndale started and looked at Holmes with amazement. Then you walked rapidly to the vicarage. By the way, you were wearing the same rib-soled tennis shoes that you have on now. There you passed through the garden, climbed the fence, and found yourself directly beneath Tregennies' windows. It was already quite light, but the house was still asleep. You took several pebbles from your pocket and threw them at the second-floor window. Sterndale sprang up. You are the devil himself, he cried. Holmes smiled. 2 or 3 handfuls, and Tregennies came to the window. You signaled him to come down. He dressed in haste and descended to the sitting room. You entered through the window. A short conversation took place, during which you paced back and forth across the room. Then you stepped out of the window and closed it behind you, while you remained on the lawn, smoking a cigar and watching what was happening in the room. When Mortimer Tregennies died, you departed by the same way. Now, Dr. Sterndale, how do you explain your conduct, and what was the motive for your actions? Do not attempt to evade or trifle with me, for I warn you that in that case, others will take up the matter. During Holmes's indictment, our guest's face had turned an ashen gray. Now he covered his face with his hands and sank into a heavy silence. Then, suddenly, he took a photograph from an inner pocket and flung it upon the rough table. "That is why I did it," he said. It was the portrait of a very beautiful woman. Holmes looked closely at it. "Brenda Tregennies," said he. "Yes, Brenda Tregennies," our guest echoed. "For years I have loved her. For years she has loved me. It is no wonder that I preferred the seclusion of Cornwall. Only here was I near the only being dear to me. I could not marry her, because I am married. My wife left me many years ago, but the absurd English laws do not permit me a divorce. For years Brenda waited. For years I waited. And this is what we have come to." Sterndale's giant frame shook, and he clutched at his throat to stifle his sobs. Mastering himself with an effort, he continued, "The vicar knew of this. We entrusted him with our secret. He can tell you what an angel she was. That is why he telegraphed me in Plymouth, and I returned. Could I think of luggage or Africa when I learned what fate had overtaken my beloved? There is the key to my conduct, Mr. Holmes." "Go on," said my friend. Dr. Sterndale took a small paper packet from his pocket and laid it upon a table. On it was written, "Red Expedis Diaboli," and a red label bore the word poison. He pushed the packet toward me. "I understand that you are a doctor. Are you acquainted with this substance? The devil's foot root? I have never heard of it. It is no disparagement to your professional knowledge," he remarked, "for I believe that, save for another specimen in a laboratory at Buda, this is the only one in Europe. It is as yet unknown to the pharmacopoeia or to the literature of toxicology. The root is shaped like a foot, half human, half goat-like, which is why a missionary botanist gave it such a fanciful name. In certain parts of Western Africa, the medicine men use it for their own purposes. This specimen I obtained under extraordinary circumstances in the Ubangi country." With these words, he opened the packet, and we saw a heap of reddish-brown powder, not unlike snuff. "Go on, sir," said Holmes sternly. "I am nearly finished, Mr. Holmes, and since you already know so much, it is in my own interest to tell you everything to the end. I have already mentioned my kinship with the Tregennies family. For the sake of the sister, I maintained a friendship with the brothers. After a quarrel over money, this Mortimer moved away from them, but later everything seemed to be settled, and I met him just as I did the others. He was a cunning, hypocritical schemer, and for various reasons, I did not trust him, but I had no cause for a quarrel. Some 2 weeks ago, he came to see my African curiosities. When we came to this powder, I told him of its strange properties, how it stimulates the nerve centers which control the sense of fear, and how the wretched natives, chosen for this ordeal by the tribal priest, either die or lose their reason. I mentioned that European science was powerless to detect its presence. I cannot imagine when he took it, for I did not leave the room. But I suppose it happened while I was unlocking cabinets and searching through drawers. I remember well that he plied me with questions as to the quantity required and the speed of its action, but it never entered my head what purpose he had in mind. I realized it only when the vicar's telegram reached me in Plymouth. That rogue Tregennies calculated that I would already be at sea, knowing nothing, and would remain in the wilds of Africa for many years. I returned immediately. As soon as I heard the details, I knew he had used my poison. I came to you then to see if there were any other explanation, but there could be no other. I was convinced that the murderer was Mortimer Tregennies. He knew that if the members of his family lost their minds, he would have sole control over their common property. Therefore, for the sake of money, he used the devil's foot root, drove his brothers mad, and killed Brenda, the only one I ever loved, the only one who ever loved me. That was his crime. What, then, was to be his retribution? Should I go to the law? What evidence had I? Certainly, the facts are undeniable. But would a local jury believe such a fantastic tale? They might, or they might not. And I cannot take the risk. My soul thirsted for vengeance. I have already told you, Mr. Holmes, that I have spent nearly all my life outside the law and have ended by becoming a law unto myself. This was such a case. I was determined that Mortimer should share the fate of his kin. Had I failed, I would have dealt with him with my own hands. There is no man in all England who values his life less than I do. Now you know everything. Indeed, after a sleepless night, I left my house. Realizing it would be difficult to wake Mortimer, I gathered some pebbles from the gravel pile you mentioned and threw them at his window. He came down and admitted me to the sitting room through the window. I accused him of his crime. I told him that I was both his judge and his executioner. At the sight of my revolver, the coward sank into a chair as if he had been hamstrung. I lit the lamp, heaped the poison upon the guard, and, leaving the room, stood by the window. I would have shot him had he tried to escape. In 5 minutes he was dead. My God, how he suffered! But my heart was turned to stone, for he had shown no mercy to my innocent Brenda. That is all, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps, had you ever loved, you might have done the same. Be that as it may, I am in your hands. Do what you deem best. I have already said that I value my life at nothing. Holmes remained silent for a while. What were your plans for the future? He asked after a pause. I had intended to bury myself in Central Africa. My work there is but half finished. Go and finish it, said Holmes. I, at least, have no intention of preventing you. Dr. Sterndale rose to his full, giant height, bowed solemnly to us, and walked out of the summer house. Holmes lit his pipe and handed me his pouch. I hope this smoke will seem more pleasant to you, said he. Do you agree, Watson, that we should not interfere in this matter? We conducted our inquiries privately, and we may act in the same way. You do not accuse this man, do you? Certainly not, I replied. I have never loved Watson, but had my loved one met such a fate, perhaps I might have acted as did our law-defying lion hunter. Who knows? Well, Watson, I will not offend you by explaining what is already clear. The starting point of my investigation was, of course, the gravel upon the windowsill. There was none such in the vicar's garden. It was only after I became interested in Dr. Sterndale and his house that I discovered where the pebbles came from. The lamp burning in broad daylight, and the remains of the powder upon the guard were links in a perfectly clear chain. And now, my dear Watson, let us banish the whole matter from our minds and return with a clear conscience to the study of those Chaldean roots, which are surely to be traced in the Cornish branch of the great Celtic language.